Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 114, the Movie Brats and the Modern Blockbuster.
That's right, we're going to be talking about the Movie Brats, which are possibly some of the most famous filmmakers, certainly the most famous directors.
Even if you don't know them by the Movie Brats, you know all of their names. Yeah.
Yeah. This is when popular film directors became household names. Before that, maybe Hitchcock.
Mm-hmm.
But that was it, and he did a very publicized push. But this was the point where directors became their own brands. So these are names like Spielberg, Coppola, De Palma, which are the three we're covering today. Mm-hmm. But also people like Schrader, Lucas, Milius, other people who kind of grew up in the 60s and came of age in the late 60s, early 70s, kind of the spin out from the American New Wave, where we shift kind of away from indie movie making back into...
We're kind of putting the values of the American New Wave into big budget Hollywood now.
Yeah, well, we're kind of putting the style of the American New Wave into big budget Hollywood now. It is the reformation of big budget Hollywood after the collapse of the studio system. Mm-hmm. So the big budget movies reign supreme, but now there's fewer of them. They're allowed to cuss and show nudity and have action and gore and blood and be considered A movies. And all of these people are also the reason they're called film brats is that they grew up with movies. They're the first generation to really go to the first film schools that existed in the country.
So they're watching the old auteurs as defined by the French New Wave and
highly influenced.
Yeah, and then ingesting that and just putting all of it into their own work and kind of just remixing it. And so we're going to see a lot of influence. We're going to see a lot of Hitchcock in these movies. We're going to see a lot of even stuff like John Ford. There's a direct Battleship Potemkin reference that we'll have to get into. But we're seeing these people who just grew up loving film and then making films out of a love for film to a critical and a commercial success, which is typically fairly rare. And so that's kind of one of the things that these guys bring to the table. But what are the movies specifically that we're going to be covering that span this era, quote unquote?
Well, of course, we have to talk about the first blockbuster, or what's considered the first blockbuster of all time, Jaws from 1975, directed by Steven Spielberg, based on the book of the same name by Peter Benchley from 1974. It won Oscars for Best Sound, Best Film Editing, and Best Original Score. And of course, it was nominated for, but did not win, Best Picture. This is also the period of time where we see a big divergence between what's really popular and what wins Best Picture. It's starting here. This is when Oscar bait really starts to become a true thing. If that's very identifiable even by the most casual of laymen. Then we're going to talk about Apocalypse Now from 1979, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It's based, of course, as anybody who's watched it, even if you haven't read the book, can tell you, on Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad from 1899. 1 year short of being 19. It won Oscars for Best Cinematography and Best Sound, and it was nominated for, but did not win, Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor for Duvall, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Set Decoration, and Best Film Editing. And then we're going to be talking about The Untouchables from 1987, the Brian De Palma movie that I like, but do not love, which is strange for me in De Palma movies. It was directed, of course, by Brian De Palma, maybe the most oddball of all of the Movie Brats. I don't know. That's up for debate. But this film is based on the book of the same name by Eliot Ness and Oscar Fraley from 1957, which is odd to have a double author book like that, but it happens.
Well, do those names sound familiar, Alex?
Are those a little bit? What do they do?
So Eliot Ness and Oscar Fraley are two of the, quote unquote, characters in the film, because the film is based on the actual events of taking down Al Capone, and Elliot Ness, played by Kevin Costner, actually wrote this book with one of the other guys in the operation, and so this is based on their firsthand account of the events depicted in the film.
You know what? That explains a lot.
Yeah.
But awesome. That explains a lot. I kind of actually like that angle on this. So this won an Oscar for Sean Connery for Best Supporting Actor. And this was also nominated for Best Set Decoration, Costume Design, and Original Score. I'm actually surprised that this didn't get a nomination for Best Picture, because I think of this as such a dad movie, which typically end up being Best Picture Kevin nominations.
Costner, yeah.
But I think one of the important reasons to consider why I think of this as a dad movie is that this is the era that your and I's father's generations, Jonathan, were growing up and watching these movies. So this influenced their taste largely. So that's why there's they like stuff like Bridge of Spies nowadays.
Yeah. These are the Joss Whedons of our parents' generation.
Yeah, so this influences what this current generation is voting on for Best Picture. So that makes a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm. And it is kind of the most blatantly cinephilic. I feel like there's the most blatant film influence in this film.
It's and we'll discuss whether or not that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Or when it's a good thing and when it's a bad thing in this movie. But we'll get to that because we have two other movies to get through first, starting with Jaws from 1975. Jason, take it away.
Jaws from 1975. A small beach town named Amity Island realizes it has a shark problem just before they're expecting a large holiday crowd for the 4th of July. New in town police chief Brody, along with shark expert Hooper and amateur shark hunter Quint, must set out to catch the monster before Amity's tourist festivities come back to bite them.
All right, guys, so let's start off with Jaws. First thing that I want to talk about before we even get into the blockbuster stuff and the media push, which is all very important to how we consume movies today and how we got to the Marvel Wonderland that we currently live in for now.
That's really where we're going with all of this.
That's very much where this all ends up. That's how Hollywood's become what it is today. Let's talk about the idea of high concept versus low concept movies.
And stories in general.
And stories in general. So low concept movies are typically very hard to sum up. They're movies that are and it's not about the nuance that exists within a movie, because nuance and character can exist within a movie. Mm-hmm. It's based more on the presentation.
Like kind of like plot-driven movies where a lot of stuff happens, and that's kind of the point, but you can't say it all. Like when we tried to describe Pride and Prejudice.
You like trying to describe Pride and Prejudice or something like Citizen Kane, even though you can kind of put your finger on what it's about at its core, it's very difficult to do so.
Yeah, you can't just say like
the concept
Rosebud.
of the movie is not the foremost appeal of the movie or the thing on presentation the most in the movie. It's there because every movie has a concept, but the character drama or the writing tends to drive the plot more. Whereas in a high concept movie, you can sum up what it's about typically in one or two sentences, and most often in like a word. So in Jaws, it's very easy. Shark.
Yeah.
You can sum up like the entire movie in that. There's a man-eating shark and someone has to stop it. And you can make a really good movie about it. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with a lot of these high concept movies. But it does... Because it's putting that on its forefront of presentation, it tends to suffer in other areas because you only have so much space in one movie for so many things. So while you can sit there with your conspiracy board with all the posters and red dots and your eyes dilated and twitching from days full of caffeine and be like, the shark is about like how nature's destroying man because man destroys nature and it's stuff like that. It's really, you really have to dig to get into heavy thematic stuff in this movie. There's some thematic stuff, of course, in here about responsibility. There's a thread that comes up in like the last act of the movie about manliness that isn't there for like the first half, but in no way are the themes of this movie the forefront.
Yeah. So this is something that would say differentiate Jaws from Moby Dick, because you can't really sum up Moby Dick by saying it's about a guy chasing a whale. Like, you can, but that's not really what the movie itself is about.
It's inherently reductionist.
Yeah, Jaws is and this goes into, like, you have to know the movie, but Jaws, you can say it's about a shark terrorizing a town, and that's more accurate to the
really
overall picture
out
of the film.
Yeah, you're not really missing anything.
Yeah, right. Although there are things that go into that, like bureaucratic stubbornness and ego and all that kind of stuff that is in there. It's just we're driven along by the fact that there's a shark terrorizing the town.
Yeah. So high concept versus low concept at no way at all impact the level of storytelling. Although
quality,
there are definitely people out there who will tell you that it does, but it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. You think of half of science fiction is high concept.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very high concept. And even in high concept movies, you can have deep resonant themes. It's just not the forefront of the movie. You can go through the entire movie, miss the theme, and not have really lost anything for the experience.
Right, for the experience.
So or specifically talking about sci-fi, 2001: A Space Odyssey, low concept movie.
Yeah, maybe the bottom of low concept.
A low concept movie. A movie like Aliens, high concept movie.
Mm-hmm. Both great in very different ways.
Yeah, very, very different ways. But one you can sum up in a couple sentences, one you can't. And it's just
and you can sum up Alien almost the exact same way you can sum up Jaws.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, they're part of the same wave, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
And
which
Ridley
we've already
Scott,
done an episode on Ridley Scott, but he
just
kind
by
of
the
falls in
sake
here.
of being British and like a little bit younger is technically not a film brat, but he basically is. He might as well be.
Same era.
He's in the same boat, certainly, which apparently needs to be bigger. But that's the history. That's low concept versus high concept. So very different types of movies, and that high concept is kind of what's come to dominate the film industry in a lot of ways, and it's become a split. If it comes out in a theater, it's probably high concept. If it comes out at a festival and you have to like stream it on like this weird third party site you've never heard of before,
if it has the A24 logo on it,
or if it has the it's probably low concept. But anyway. Jonathan, do you want to talk about the influence of one Mr. Hitchcock, one of your favorite filmmakers, on this movie?
Yeah, let's do it. And we're going to talk about Hitchcock a lot. But there is, I think I was noticing it more this time because I was, watching this movie for it this time. But obviously I've seen this several times before. But I think I never like completely connected Hitchcock with this film outside of, like the Vertigo shot that's super famous of Roy Scheider sitting on the beach watching. But one of the things that kind of distances it from Hitchcock is that it's so bright. Like the whole movie takes place during the day, except for a select number of scenes. And so you don't get like the really Hitchcockian noir lighting very much. But in the technique, in the camera movement, in the editing in the beach sequences is just so precise to build that kind of suspense, and it's so intentional in the way that Hitchcock would think about every single shot before he got out there to film. That's what you're seeing in the way that Spielberg is putting this film together, in the way that he's using Kuleshov effect to, build tension and make you expect the shark in places where it's not coming and not expect it in the places where it is coming. So again, it's that intentionality about these filmmakers who have studied Hitchcock's method. They have the Hitchcock Truffaut book and it's falling apart in their offices and stuff like that. So they know exactly what they're doing with their filmmaking, to the point where what we're going to see in all of these films, I know a little bit less about the Untouchables, but at the very least, Jaws and Apocalypse Now have notorious production histories in the fact that they were so demanding just from a logistical perspective and also from a directorial perspective. So one of the most famous anecdotes is about Spielberg making the production shut down every time he would see a boat on the horizon in the scenes when our three musketeers, so to speak, are out chasing the shark. And they're supposed to be out in the middle of the ocean. They don't have rotoscoping and the VFX capability that we do now, where they probably would have just shot it in a tank. But they're fairly close to the beach, and so anytime there's like a sailboat on the horizon, Spielberg's like, everyone stop until the horizon is clear. And that could take like 2 hours for it to go across the entire horizon. And that, along with other things like their mechanical sharks failing and stuff like that, made the production cost so high that it almost didn't get Spielberg another job until Lucas stepped in for him.
I mean, he did very purposefully do it the hard way, because it's not like they didn't have tanks they could have shot in, but he wanted it to look a certain way. And I respect that, because honestly, it looks very good out on the open water. Going back to the beach thing real quick, I just want to bring up a quick little thing that I always catch. Do you know, nobody watches TV on TV anymore, but back when I was a kid, way back in my day, after every TV show, you'd get the little like 1 second long show production company's logo, and it typically had some audio on it, like Bad Robot. But there's one that was That's One Bad Habit, Harry, and that's from this movie. And I always watch for that one part whenever I have to see this movie again, which is frequently.
Oh yeah, with the old guy.
Yeah,
and he just leaves.
Although the entire idea of that beach scene is quite impressive. Again, from the Hitchcock angle, the idea that the audience of dramatic irony, where the audience knows that there's a bomb under the table, but the people don't know that there's a bomb under the table. So the entire time you're waiting for this bomb to go off, and they could be talking about anything, but it becomes more interesting. Everything that happens on the beach in the lead up to the shark actually attacking is quite mundane and boring, but it's all made incredibly dramatic by the fact that our sheriff knows that there's a shark out there that could attack at any moment and is expecting it. And we're entirely engrossed in his point of view. So it's like a form of shared dramatic irony where the audience is placed solely in the sheriff's shoes for that duration of that scene to get the same effect.
Yeah, and then Spielberg one-ups the bomb under the table in the second beach scene when they think that they've got the shark, but the audience knows that, the movie's only been going for half an hour, so the shark's still out there. And basically Hitchcock is like, Spielberg is like, look, the bomb is under this table. And then psych, nope, the bomb's under that table in the kiddie pool. And so he's able to pull off the same thing twice by using your expectation of the first time and subverting it in order to basically fool me twice, shame on me.
Yeah, exactly. Although it always bugged me that they call it the pool, because it's not a pool. Like,
it
what
opens
why
up
would you
into
call
the
it a
lake
pool?
too. It's more like a lagoon or something.
Yeah, or like an inlet. I don't know all of my beach terminology. I just know it's not a pool.
Yeah. So after we've done a lot of like setting up the tension and stuff in the town itself, and we have the really great scene of the mother whose son gets eaten by the shark. And we're not going to worry too much about spoilers in this movie because it's Jaws. Maybe we will with the other two, but here, so the widow I always think she's a widow because she's dressed in black, but she's mourning her son. So she comes up and she slaps Roy Scheider in the face. And I want to say that there's a filmumentary that I'll post a link to in the blog post called Inside Jaws, where this guy, Jamie Benning, I think his name is, he did this with the Star Wars movies. We talked about them back when we did A New Hope. But he basically takes the entire film and all of the behind the scenes stuff that he can find from various interviews and sources and cuts it into the film itself. So you can watch along the behind the scenes as you watch the film. So there's a lot of trivia from that. And I think he mentions, or there's a bit in there where it talks about how that woman is just like a school teacher from the town where they were filming. And she wasn't actually an actor, but she gave such a good performance that like the whole crew was just kind of stopped dead in their tracks while they were filming. which I could totally believe. I love that scene. But after we spend that time in the town, we get out to the open sea with Quint and Hooper and Brody, and then it's the last half of the film is a bottle film, and so now we're building suspense, but all we've got is a boat, 3 guys, and a defective mechanical shark. So how do we build tension with that?
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of becomes like a war of attrition where you start to feel pretty safe on the boat at first, and then slowly you just take away the things that that give the audience and the people on the boat security, slowly stripping away their power until the boat is gone and they're stuck in the water and there's nothing you can do. I will say there are 2 parts of this movie that I feel are kind of horror tropey in a way. Where
they were pulling on tropes, or that they have become the tropes because of this film being Jaws?
I don't know, and that's a good question. But I will say the points where our Dreyfus character, our shark expert, goes into the water, both to salvage the boat that was attacked with the 2 Yahoos on it with dynamite. And then the part where he goes in the water with the cage, I'm like, that's just...
Oh, yeah. Which they built an entire movie off of. Do you remember that from like a year or 2 ago? 47 meters deep.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's literally just 2 girls in a shark cage that sinks to the bottom. And they made like an entire 2-hour movie out of that. I was like, yeah, that was a great one scene out of Jaws.
2 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely a tense scene, but I feel like both of those scenes intentionally rack up the tension just to rack up the tension in a way.
I will say one of the things that the shark cage scene does is it gives us our only instance of real scale with the shark, because up to that point, we're hiding the shark, which is probably the next thing we'll get into, is how that has become the most useful thing that you can do in a horror film. But in that instance, we're towards the end of the film. We're almost to the climax, and so to have this this footage, some of this is real footage of sharks with a cage with a diver that's not Richard Dreyfuss in it. It shows you how big a great white shark is compared to the people. And so as we get up to, the ending of the film, it keeps that danger fresh for us because we've kind of exhausted all other ways of making the shark menacing at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to keep escalating the threat of the shark, and that's a good way to do it. Mm-hmm. Although we should talk about the big gray turd that is the shark.
Yes.
It was meant to be seen much more in this movie, but fairly infamously, the animatronic puppet essentially they built for the shark looked terrible, looked just awful,
and it kept breaking. They had 3 different animatronic sharks,
and
because
it just wouldn't work. Yeah.
I think it sunk a boat one time, and they lost a bunch of reels of audio or something. Because just everything kept going wrong out there on the water.
But there is, but essentially the decision that was reached, mostly in the editing room, was that the best way to do it was to keep the shark off screen as much as possible.
Yep.
And you notice that in the movie. Normally you might see a silhouette from the top down of the shark under the water, but that mostly obscures it. There's one point where the shark jumps out of the water and there's the shark cage scene. But for the most part, you don't see the shark. You just see the effects of the shark. And you're given enough hints at its dimension, scale, or even presence through the usage of the fin. Breaking through the water, or just the soundtrack.
And the barrels eventually.
Yeah, that you become scared of it. And your mind fills in the blanks because that's what the human mind is good at. Seeing a mystery, seeing the unknown, and being afraid of it, filling in the blanks. It becomes, by keeping it off screen, not only does it become scarier just because that's scary, the unknown is scary to humans, but your mind fills in the scariest version of a shark personally to you that you could possibly imagine, which is a wonderful effect because it's complete customization to make the shark scary to basically everyone.
Yeah,
unless you're a shark expert who goes diving with them on the weekends, but then you're a different kind of person altogether.
Yeah, you're not the general target audience. And just looking here on Wikipedia, there's a couple of quotes where Spielberg compares what the film was going to be to like a Japanese Saturday matinee or like an old Ray Harryhausen film, which we both covered, Godzilla, the franchise, and King Kong. And so like you kind of get the sense that it could have been this really just like cheesy thing where you're just seeing the monster for the heck of it. And, you know, if the story itself, like the original Godzilla, is not carrying the film enough, then it just becomes, you know, like a cheesy popcorn flick, which not to say that this isn't a cheesy popcorn flick to some extent, but it elevates it somewhat out of that realm. And again, Spielberg even compares the end result to more Hitchcockian because of the fact that we're hiding the danger and we're letting the audience fill in the blanks and stuff like that, like we were talking about. And it also, this is another thing that is bringing up here on in these quotes from Wikipedia, is that it puts more on the actors. And so the casting actually becomes really important at that point, because now the fear is coming through the expression and performances of the actors. So when Roy Scheider walks backwards into the boat and is like, we're going to need a bigger boat, you're like, oh gosh, yeah, because he just saw it face to face for the first time. And I think along those same lines, Richard Dreyfuss does a really good job of conveying urgency at the beginning before we've really seen anything. And he's just describing, you know, your shark has a mouth this big, like you are dealing with a monster here. Because he's the only one that really like has an understanding of how dangerous this thing really is. And so he kind of carries it at the beginning, and then you know, we have Brody, Quint, and Hooper having to kind of keep ratcheting that up throughout the scene. Although there's also a lot of notorious anecdotes about Robert Shaw, who played Quint, being drunk for a lot of the filmmaking. And
is that just method acting?
I don't know, because I think it worked.
Or is he just an alcoholic?
There's the I mean, it could be a little bit of both. But I will say that I love the scar sharing scene. That's probably my favorite part of the whole film, is when we kind of have a lull in the story. Because that's another thing that this movie does really well, is it's really heightened get away from the shark moments, and then okay, we take a breather and we have them all sitting around drinking, and they're showing off their shark scars, and then he goes into the USS Indianapolis monologue, which is a true story of one of the ships from World War II that sunk, and their mission was very secret because it was related to the atomic bombs, and like 90% of the crew was eaten by sharks before a rescue got to them. And the way that he's able to convey that, and it's all like just a monologue. You're just watching him tell this story, and it's riveting. I love it so much.
Yeah, no, the acting is definitely high quality. I guess that's the strength of this movie, and most well done high concept movies, is that the individual parts are just done so well when they are done well, and click together so well that you get like this seamless, fun movie experience that you can keep coming back to over and over, and not have to go through as heavy of an experience as something like, say, Citizen Kane. Yeah. Citizen Kane is not a movie you watch over and over and over, unless you do, in which case we might need to talk. But Jaws is definitely a movie, and a lot of the other blockbusters from this era are movies that you can keep coming back to over and over and over. Do you want to talk about the term blockbuster, Jonathan?
Yeah, let's do it. I don't think I'm very clear on it, so enlighten me, Alex.
So essentially, the actual term blockbusting dates way back to the 40s in World War II, when certain bombs that could destroy a whole block at a time were called blockbusters. Some movies at the time were also called blockbusters, particularly one called The Bombardier from RKO, which was actually about dropping bombs, and it was just used as a descriptive term. Some people think it referred to the breaking the usage of the practice of block booking, which existed back during the studio systems, in which studios contracted out certain theaters to play out not only their A pictures, but also their B pictures. So even though the B pictures didn't get as much money for the theaters were still forced to take them, making the B movies still profitable to the studio. Blockbuster in the current era first came up with the Steven Spielberg movie, Jaws, which we're talking about now. It was perceived as a new cultural phenomenon. This is one of the first movies to get a really big press push before it dropped, closely followed up by Star Wars a few years later. And one of the things that both these movies did very well that became signatures of the genre or the type of movie, blockbusters, press release buildup and merchandising. So it wasn't just that Jaws came out. It was that you could get a Jaws lunchbox. You could get a Jaws shark toy. You could play the Jaws video game in an arcade. And Star Wars did it to an even higher level. And studios can't realize quite how profitable it was at that time. So one of the famous stories about Star Wars is that George Lucas famously took a pay cut from the studio in exchange for more to the exclusive rights to all merchandising. Yeah. The studio thought he was an idiot, but I think he's proven them wrong.
And I think he offered the actors cuts of the merchandising revenue too. So they all kind of won out on that one.
So essentially, it refers to movies being big, being phenomenal events that you had to go see when they came out. And typically a lot of people will go and see them over and over and over. Just like we were talking about, these are movies it's easy to go see over and over and over rather than more complicated, contextualized low concept movies. And that's how we have like the summer blockbuster trend now. Of course, Jaws played a big part of it. It was summer themed. It came out in the summer, and everyone else followed suit after that. So summer became blockbuster season. Yeah. And even we can see it now. I mean, think about Marvel. All the merchandise Marvel has spread out there. Think about how every time a Marvel movie comes out, it's typically close to the summer or in the summer, and it's an event. People go see it. It's like the one time when I go to movie theaters, back when that was a thing, that other people are actually at the theaters.
Yeah.
Rather than just a handful of people. And people go see it multiple times. So it really set a trend for how Hollywood works now. Good and bad things came of that. The good thing is you get this kind of like this new cool type of movie that didn't exist before. There was other stuff like it. Obviously, Spielberg and Lucas were heavily inspired by adventure serials and horror and adventure movies from the golden era of Hollywood. But now you have all of that B movie fun with triple A movie production value thrown in there, along with people at the helm who are willing to do these genre movies that are now mainstream, that have spent all of that time studying and have become in their way, each in their own unique way, film experts. So you have that. The downside is that over the next 4 or 5 decades after this movie came out, every other type of movie got shoved out of the box office. Now, part of that, a lot of that took refuge in television, especially in the past 10 or 20 years, where people started to make more meaningful TV, more low concept TV shows, like the HBO era, like Breaking Bad, like, well, I was about to say Game of Thrones, but that's something different entirely. That's just throwing money at the wall, kind of.
Like Sopranos,
yeah. So, but essentially what happened is low concept movies got completely drummed out of theaters. You don't see them there anymore. You see them in film festivals or on the Criterion channel, and that's kind of it, and that's kind of sad.
Or if
and
it's like
you mentioned,
Christopher Nolan,
Jonathan,
maybe.
Yeah. I mean, even Christopher Nolan does some high concept stuff.
Yeah,
a lot of his stuff I would put in the high concept category.
Yeah, because it is a thing that starts with more or less a gimmick, and then it's just he does a better job of fleshing it out than a lot of people.
Yeah, he has a place he's trying to go, rather than just exploring the gimmick of its own in its own right.
Which is what great sci-fi does anyway.
Yeah, so it is positive and negative, and it's pretty much the reason why we will probably never see a super high quality, low concept movie come out in theaters to a wide release or a wide event ever again.
Yeah.
Probably not going to happen.
Regardless of the way that
at home viewing might change it again.
Yeah. Regardless of the way that theater releases are going to be changing for any number of reasons at this point.
But I'm willing to bet that theaters, as they exist, and when you think of your AMC theater, they will be catering to the event showings from here on out, if they exist at all. I mean, even theaters like the Draft House or ArcLight will cater to these events when they come out, because you can't pass up on that money.
Yeah.
But that is about all for Jaws. I think we've been on Jaws for quite a while. So let's move on to Apocalypse Now from 1979. Jason, take it away.
Apocalypse Now from 1979. Captain Benjamin Willard, a soldier during the Vietnam War, already struggling with PTSD, is given an assignment to track down and assassinate a rogue colonel named Kurtz, who has taken military force into his own hands and convinced a Vietnamese village to worship him as a demigod. Willard and a small crew set off down the Nung River and have various encounters with soldiers on both sides of the war, which reveal the baser aspects of human nature.
Now, speaking of, Alex, this is probably the lowest concept movie on our list this week. I mean,
I would definitely rank this in the lowest of the concepts of these movies.
It's coming from Joseph Conrad's, Heart of Darkness is extremely low concept. Apocalypse Now consolidates the ideas a little bit more. But
so here's where I would argue with Heart of Darkness being low concept. Would you consider Dante's Inferno to be low concept?
That's a good question. But
I would say it has themes in it.
Yeah,
obviously, but it is very high concept-y, right? And I think
it's more low concept than the Inferno, though.
I don't know about that because
the Inferno is more fantasy.
I mean, this is fair, but I also see this movie as being kind of a fantastical exploration of certain aspects of reality. Like reality's definitely been packed into this powder keg. It's kind of an examination of American culture in a lot of ways, but through the powder keg or magnifying glass of the Vietnam War. But even further than that, the specific journey of this man down this river, that constitutes an even further concentrating of those ideas for examination. And so it almost becomes this concept of we're just going to go down the river and we're going to encounter something next. And we're going to go down the river and we're going to encounter something next.
It's an odyssey.
And he doesn't... It is very much an odyssey, and that feels like the concept to me because he doesn't end up making a character choice. He makes like a character choice at the start of the movie and then like one at the end of the movie.
Yeah, and
that's kind of it.
It's less about what's his name in this movie? Willard's arc, so to speak. It's more about it's an exploration. Yeah,
it's about the journey.
Yeah, I get you. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I definitely agree that this is the most low concept out of the three, but I also definitely see this as being like a high concept movie, like Army Special Forces officer, or whatever his position's name is, has to travel down a river to take out a man very similar to him. Along the way, he examines a mini many apocalyptic scenarios that seem to harp on certain realities within America and the world at large.
Yeah.
Like it's definitely a longer log line than Jaws, but it's also nowhere near as complicated as your low concept drama.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, let's get into some of the themes because I mean, the concept of going down the river. So I think this is my kind of the thing that puts it in a gray area is the fact that watching him go down the river would not be interesting without the thematic undertones. Jaws would be interesting just for the fact of chasing a shark. Apocalypse Now is not quite as interesting just watching a guy go down the river in Vietnam. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So, but as we go down, we're focusing on these themes of power lust, I think is the main thing. And also this really kind of base, primeval aspects of human nature. And basically each encounter that Willard has, a character played by Martin Sheen, kind of just amplifies this idea until we get to Kurtz, who is the epitome of this idea of power lust. And so as we get to Robert Duvall's character, and he goes in and bombs an entire village just to have a place to surf. You know, it sounds absolutely insane and monomaniacal until, again, we get to Kurtz, who has an entire village under his, playing God with an entire village, basically, and with broader aspirations, just less physical capability by the time that we meet him.
Yeah, he's definitely gone down. He went down the journey that Willard is essentially taking, but reached a very different end.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I do want to bring up about this movie, because I think this applies to all three of the movies, is that this strain of filmmaking is one that there's a thing where all of these filmmakers will set up rules for the film and they will stick to them. So in Apocalypse Now, one of the rules is do not leave the boat. The boat symbolizes sanity, and the farther and longer that you are from the boat, the more you are devolving into this really primeval and savage form of humanity. And so that's why Willard is always saying, Kurtz left the boat. He never planned to get back on the boat. Don't leave the boat. Let's get back to the boat. Whenever they get to Kurtz, I think Chef says, let's go back to the boat for a little bit. And so they do, and they go. And so the boat is this symbolism of sanity that is being assaulted from all sides by savagery. And, the closer you can hold to the boat, the more you're able to keep your hold on sanity. And, to the point that Martin Sheen's character kind of, how he walks away from that based on his experience with Kurtz is kind of up in the air, because we don't see too much afterwards, but we know he makes it out. He makes it, back to the boat and back to civilization, but he has been changed by his experiences leaving the boat. So there are things, there's a really blatant one I want to bring up in the Untouchables too. And then there are things more subtle in Jaws, but things that were set up in films like Francis Ford Coppola's Godfather trilogy about, colors foreshadowing people's deaths. So like we talked about in The Godfather, where oranges usually indicate someone is going to die. In Jaws, if you see a yellow, there's usually something really bad is about to happen. So these are little filmmaking tricks that seem to be kind of a common thread throughout the films of these filmmakers.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of those techniques in here because they've spent all of their time trying to learn how other people did it, and then they start to learn those rules, learn how to do motifs and themes, and then they innovate on their own. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about the cursed production of this movie, Jonathan?
Yeah, and I don't know
the absolute disaster that was the making of Apocalypse Now.
I haven't even had a chance.
Basically destroyed Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah, I haven't even had a chance to go through the whole thing.
There's like multiple documentaries about it.
Yeah, the most famous documentary is called Hearts of Darkness. Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse. But yeah, so this film was shot on location in the Philippines. And there are stories of huge, elaborate sets that they built. I mean, they basically built an entire temple for the Kurtz scene. But all this stuff, a hurricane came through in the middle of production, just destroyed everything. Martin Sheen had a heart attack that almost killed him. Did Francis Ford Coppola get sick, or what happened?
Oh,
with Coppola himself.
I did not watch Hearts of Darkness.
I know I haven't had a chance to either.
But yeah, the dance
it's just
part
one
is
of those
very full.
where everything that could have gone wrong on the film did go wrong, and it's one of these films that's almost a miracle that it got made. I think there's a what was it? They had a production timeline of like 17 weeks, and it ended up taking them like 3 years or something to make. And it was publicized the whole time, so these are coming out in the Hollywood tabloids and stuff, and just so much buildup for this film is one of the things that leads to it being a blockbuster as well. Admittedly, less of like a popcorn munching blockbuster than Jaws, because it does have a lot more, honestly, just darkness to it. But it is something that, you feel identified with it if you're keeping up with all of these things that are going on, and you're like, wow, is this film going to be worth it? And then it comes out, and it is a big movie. It has a lot of themes and stuff to chew on in it. And Coppola did a really good job of bringing that all out within the filmmaking, because it's a journey just to watch it,
Yeah, no, it's involved. It's actually quite the taxing experience, which is kind of the opposite of what I found from Jaws. I always feel a little drained when I get to the end of Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, which is definitely part of the point, because you're not supposed to leave it feeling very, very cheery about yourself or about humanity. But that's also in keeping with Conrad's story as well.
Yeah. No, that's kind of the point, right? They're exhausted by the end. We're exhausted by the end.
Yeah.
You just kind of want to get back on the boat and go home.
Yeah. Speaking of the Film Brats, though, the one tidbit that I found on Wikipedia while looking this up is that Lucas was originally slated to direct the film, and I think Coppola was just going to produce it, and then Lucas decided to go off and do a different project, so Coppola got the chance to direct it. And I can only imagine how different George Lucas's career would be viewed now if he had created this film, and how different this film would be in itself.
Very different. Ooh. Now,
which is crazy.
I think it's important that Coppola was the one to make this movie, and that it almost killed him in the process.
Yeah, but he survived. So
I feel like barely.
I think the other thing is just to kind of talk about Kurtz as a character. Oh, first of all, we see an actor that we saw on the podcast last episode in a very different capacity. And I completely forgot that Lawrence Fishburne was in this movie.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
He's just so young that he's...
Oh, he looks so different when he's young.
Unrecognizable. Yeah.
He looks so different when he's a baby. It's so weird.
He did a great job, though.
Yeah, he definitely killed it. I mean, for some reason he's kept popping up in movies for me lately, but
you watched
always
Othello
like in that weird
recently?
Young way. Oh, I watched Boys in the Hood.
Oh, okay.
And he's super young in that one too. Not as young as Apocalypse Now, obviously, because it's like 10 years later. But still, he looks very different at a young age.
Yeah, but the actor that is most infamously connected with this film, famously and infamously, is Marlon Brando, who had started to kind of go off the deep end, as far as I can tell, by the time they were making this film. Marlon Brando had always been a method actor, and I think...
been a little nuts.
Yeah, so this is kind of the film where, like, the speculation of Heath Ledger getting a little too into his Joker character kind of also applies to Marlon Brando and his Kurtz character, where he just, like, was so into it, and this intense, blinding egotism that it seems like that kind of just stuck with him for the rest of his career. There's some really weird stories of him later on as he was kind of retiring or semi-retiring from the Hollywood scene.
Yeah. No, he's just a little nuts, which kind of makes him perfect for this role.
Right.
But yeah.
So another tidbit, though.
I just like him being crazy in this movie.
No, he does great. I mean, he fits it perfectly. It's just like, I don't know what the effect of this role was on him after the fact. But
I like how they poured water on him before every scene. They're like, let's mist you with this bottle.
Yeah.
Is your head shiny enough? No? Okay, let's mist you some more.
I mean, he's supposed to look very sick, and he looks like he's just constantly sweating to an unhealthy level every single shot.
Yeah.
So speaking of Martin Sheen's character, though, apparently Steve McQueen was originally slated to be that character, which also would have made this a pretty different film.
That'd be very different.
Yeah. And Al Pacino was offered it as well, which would have been very different in a different way.
Oh, very different. I feel like Al Pacino would have made it much more low concept, and I feel like Steve McQueen would have made it much more high concept.
That sounds completely accurate.
Also, I feel like it wouldn't have worked without an unknown in the lead, just by the nature of like the production.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying celebrities tend to get a bit demanding, but
it also changes the way you market the film too.
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
But speaking of Martin,
it stops being a Coppola movie; it would become a Steve McQueen movie.
Yeah.
Or a
it's almost a Marlon Brando movie, but
yeah, but he's in it for a very short time,
right? But speaking of Martin Sheen's character, what did you think about the use of voiceover? Because this film is almost entirely driven by Martin Sheen's internal dialogue.
I like it. It's important. It is a chronicle of a journey, and without getting essentially, because it kind of more or less boils down to a travelogue.
Yeah.
And without getting those log inputs from our viewpoint character, then we're kind of become lost. Him talking becomes the audience's boat in a way, to remind yourself that you exist outside of this scenario. Because this movie does have a tendency to draw you down into that headachy chaos territory. And you need something to buoy you back out of it. And his voice is that thing.
Yeah. And it's so much of the low concept comes through that voiceover. That is where we get all of the ideas of who Kurtz is before we see Kurtz, because we have to have this mystique built up around him before we get there. The other thing that helps with that is Dennis Hopper, who does an amazing job as the crazy prophet kind of character. But yeah, so I feel like this voiceover is one of the most necessary voiceovers that I've seen in a film in terms of contributing to the overall tone and journey of the thematic material. So I think the last thing that I want your input on about this movie, Alex, is what classic film influence do you see most heavily in this film? I don't have a clear answer to it, which is why I want to get your take on
it. That's a good question.
It almost feels the most original of the three that we're talking about.
It does, but also has definite influences. The problem is that it pulls from a lot of World War II films.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think Coppola referenced Werner Herzog's, however you say it, Aguirre, The Wrath of God.
Oh, Aguirre, The Wrath of God? Oh, yeah. That makes perfect sense. I actually thought that one came out after this. But yeah, have you seen Aguirre?
I haven't.
Because it's Heart of Darkness, but like Conquistadors.
Okay.
So yeah, kind of the same deal. That actually makes perfect sense. I did not realize that the influence went in that direction. But yeah. I mean, mostly I was just going to say the World War II films were a big part of it. and then probably anything from the Italian neo-realistic portion, because I feel like that's when war in movies started getting depicted really brutally.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the 40s and the early 50s. So that would kind of make sense. Something like Paisan or Roma Città Aperta or something like that would make a lot of sense.
The other thing that I would throw out, just because you had kind of already brought up Citizen Kane, but I could definitely see a lot of Orson Welles influence in this in terms of the bigness of the scope and the ideas that are being tackled or attempted.
Is it just because there's a large man sweating profusely spinning
in the
dialogue?
shadows?
In the shadows? Is that what this is about, Jonathan?
Maybe, but I mean, it's not unwarranted, I feel like.
You know what? Yeah, I could see it. I could definitely see that. It makes sense.
And it's about, I mean, if you go back to the idea that that we've brought up before, I can't remember who originated it, probably one of the Cahiers du Cinema guys, but that all films either come down to Bicycle Thieves or Citizen Kane. I think this one definitely falls on the Citizen Kane end of the spectrum in terms of
for sure.
the
Actually,
egotism.
You know what? That entire spectrum is low concept, high concept.
That's true. Yeah.
I mean, Bicycle Thieves is just about my bike got stolen and then the fallout from that. Mm-hmm. And there's really complicated themes on it because that's the tendency of that filmmaker, but it is definitely high concept. Whereas Citizen Kane is as low concept as it could get, because the whole point of Citizen Kane is that the essence of humanity defies singular conception.
Yeah.
Because one person cannot be boiled down to one thing.
The only way that you can sum up that movie is by saying Rosebud, which begs explanation in itself.
Yeah. So that actually makes perfect sense. Yeah. They just said what we said before we said it, and they probably said it better.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's about as much boiling down as we can do for Apocalypse Now. So let's move on to The Untouchables, shall we?
Let's do it. Jason, take it away.
The Untouchables from 1987. During the American Prohibition era, Al Capone had created an empire of black market alcohol sales in Chicago, but managed to keep his name almost entirely disconnected from the illegal activity. Bureau of Prohibition agent Elliot Ness is assigned to bring down Capone's whole organization. To do this, he gathers a small group of officers he can trust to go after the kingpin by the books, which means no partaking of alcohol themselves. As tensions and risks elevate, each member of the Untouchables will be pushed to their moral limits.
All right, Jonathan, how many Brian De Palma movies have you seen?
That's a good question. Let me look this up, because it might be this one, which I had not seen until this.
Have you seen the first Mission Impossible? Because that's normally the other one that most people have seen from him.
But it's been a long time.
But this is a good Brian De Palma movie, but it feels weird to me in a lot of ways, because it almost feels like he's trying to be a blockbuster, which he achieves, but he isn't necessarily a blockbuster filmmaker. He really shines when he's not in that blockbuster setting. A lot of his stuff is almost intentionally salacious and not sanitized, and this one, except for the occasional bit of ultraviolence, is fairly sanitized.
Yeah.
And when this one does dip into ultraviolence, it's actually kind of when it's at its best.
Yeah, like
but a lot of the conversation almost feels, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. A lot of the dialogue exchanges here feel,
you know what, I kept
feel
feeling
like they're acting out two cops retelling their story in like a very subjective way.
It feels to me like it's going for an era of filmmaking that has passed. So it seems very much, I kept coming back to Hitchcock again with this one. I think just in like the texture and the colors of the film stock itself, like in a very basic aesthetic sense. But there's also that in the noir aspects, like especially at the very beginning, that first raid and stuff like that, and some of the stuff in Connery's apartment, all that stuff. But also in the sense that it doesn't quite hit Hitchcock. It feels like charade to me, which is a really direct homage to Hitchcock, which we've already talked about. So it feels like a game of telephone going back to Hitchcock and this kind of like really early noir, very theatrical and put on form of filmmaking, which has basically disappeared by the time that we've gone through the American New Wave with Easy Rider and some of the and Bonnie and Clyde and some of the really intense raw stuff that doesn't have that theatrical facade over it anymore.
Yeah. It's I think one of my other problems with it is that it is very theatrical, but Kevin Costner, as much as he's good at certain things, and I feel like we've had this entire discussion before, I actually like Kevin Costner, but I agree with Kevin Costner where we both don't understand why he's famous, because he said that before. He doesn't make sense in this role to me. I get why somebody would want him to play them in what is essentially a low-key biopic, because he is the American everyman in a lot of ways. But in this, where Sean Connery is like being this like hyper over-the-top Irish cop who's super intense, like Costner just cannot live up to that intensity, which is kind of a shame in a lot of ways, because it feels a little awkward. It feels like your suburban dad living out like a cop fantasy, which is weird. And that's the other thing that felt really weird about this film, just because we're covering it when we're covering it, is that it does involve a lot of police justifying the use of excessive force and murdering criminals, in a time where that's a hot button question in America right now. So it was hard not to view it in this light. And I had seen this movie before. And I did think the first time I saw it that it did feel like a lot of self-justification about being super violent, which I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. I did not realize that it was a biopic about two guys essentially retelling their own stories, which makes me a little queasy in some ways.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's also another level in there. At the very end of the film, it says something like, based on the TV show, The Untouchables, based on the book, The Untouchables by these people. So there's like a lot of layers, and I think there's a lot of kind of hype that kind of gets translated up. Maybe, I don't know. I haven't read the book. And I don't know the history of the story of Al Capone's downfall and all that kind of thing. But it does feel like it's trying to meld like a kind of Hays Codian noir storytelling with the ultra-violence brought about by the American New Wave in films like Bonnie and Clyde and that kind of thing, which do kind of have those ultra-violent, shocking moments. So it doesn't feel like out of place. It feels like it's falling in line with a lot of stuff that's going on in cinema at the time. But
for sure.
With throwing in a bunch of like really cinephiliac references to things like Battleship Potemkin, and I feel like the Canadian, well, I was going to say drug bust, but alcohol bust basically has a lot of like John Fordian Western themes in it and stuff like that.
It does. It very much feels like a bunch of cowboys.
Yeah.
Running around, which I will say, I think the strongest parts of this movie are just the setting, the costume work, and then the camera work. I feel like all three of those shine big time. The setting obviously is just super fun to doing anything like Prohibition era. Like that's always going to be fun and look good on camera. The camera work is all Brian De Palma, which is one of the things he's known about, is using this very obvious
it's so obvious. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's what we see in the American New Wave is filmmakers lose the obsession with keeping the camera hidden. Or not that you see the camera in frame, but you don't want the audience to consciously know that they're looking through a camera.
Yeah.
Whereas in the American blockbuster, you become very aware that you're looking through a camera. when effects become very obvious, like in Jaws, where they do the rack focus, dolly forward on our sheriff at the beach. That's a very that the camera's doing weird shit, but it's used in a very particular way. Brian De Palma is famous for using very obvious camera work for very stylistic purposes, but to such an extent that a lot of his movies end up being and feeling very intentionally voyeuristic.
Yeah.
Which what this often feels like, which works because both sides are spying on each other and watching each other all the time.
Yeah. The biggest example I could think of in this one, or that stood out to me probably the most, I mean, I kept feeling it throughout the film. I think there are about 10 or 15 uses of split diopter in this film. And there's also several in Jaws.
Oh gosh, there's so many. Yeah.
But when
it's not like super subtle split diopter either. No. It's very clearly split diopter.
The one in the freaking chapel, it bothered me to no end because it felt so unmotivated. It was like there was one shot looking up at Connery and Costner at the like chapel ceiling, and then there was another shot that was like Costner's face right in the camera and Connery behind him, and they're both in focus, and it's just like, oh my gosh, it's too much focus.
Well, what if he didn't want to open up, Jonathan? Huh?
I know, he just and he couldn't
what
like take 2 steps
on the
away.
F-stop he was on.
I know, he did it intentionally. I understand, but also the scene where the assassin or fake assassin, as it turns out, goes into Connery's apartment, and it's all first person for like 5 minutes of camera moving, which
you put the camera, that's a signature De Palma move. He does a lot of that.
When you put the camera in first person, it's basically breaking the fourth wall as a director.
Yeah. It basically is. It's very conscious of what it's doing. He loves doing the long first person takes. He does it in a lot of his movies, typically with someone sneaking up on like a girl in the shower and murdering them, which again, very influenced.
Yeah, very Hitchcockian.
Very intentionally influenced.
Yeah. Let's talk about the stairway sequence, just because it's like the glaring thing that I feel like we have to get to with this movie. You know what I'm talking about, right? It's like, it's got to be...
Oh, the Odessa Steps.
Yes.
You could either call it an homage or you could call it a rip, and I don't know which one to call it. Well, I do know which one to call it, but I'm gonna be diplomatic about it.
Yeah. So there's a sequence where Costner is waiting for an informant that he needs to come out of this train that's about to arrive. A woman is taking an agonizingly long time to pull her baby stroller and 2 huge luggage bags up this gigantic staircase. And as soon as he goes to help her, the guy comes in and this shootout breaks out, which then goes into slow motion for the entirety of the sequence. And I haven't verified this, but I feel like there's a lot of forward influence on the Wachowskis and the Matrix in that sequence. I'm thinking specifically of when Neo and Trinity go into the building to rescue Morpheus, and it's just like, you know, nonstop slow motion gun shooting and, you know, cutting back and forth on who shot who and who dodged what, and like superhuman levels of gun maneuvering and reaction shots, which is endlessly entertaining, which puts this film like solidly in the popcorn movie genre again. But it does have a lot of like, you know, good versus evil themes and stuff like that going on. Again, putting it, adding a gloss of Western ideology on top of the whole thing, I feel like. But yeah, that one sequence is just so like in your face on a technical and action level that it's very exciting to watch.
Obvious.
But it feels like he wants you to be like, look at my filmmaking, look at what I know from Russian film history.
I saw Battleship Potemkin.
Yeah.
Woo!
I was waiting for her to get shot in the face, which didn't happen, but
that's one of the things that I feel like if De Palma hadn't been making a blockbuster, would have been he would have done.
If he was making,
it was
but the thing is, like, you could have done that in like The Godfather, and yet this feels like The Godfather light almost.
Yeah, it does. But I think I think I found out finally after seeing this movie multiple times what bugs me so much about that sequence is that in Battleship Potemkin, the entire point of the sequence is the terror of state-used violence against the population. And while I don't really bear any sympathy for Capone or his gang, this is a scene that very much on the nose glorifies the use of state violence for the sake of keeping order, which is the opposite of what the initial Odessa Steps scene was meant to do.
Yeah.
Which I find to be offensive in some way. It's not that you can't reverse the intent of the original use of a technique, but this isn't just the use of a technique. This is direct homage to a specific scene with specific meaning.
And the thing is,
it just feels wrong in some way.
The most effective way to do an homage is to build successively on a theme. So in Battleship Potemkin, it's about an uprising being suppressed, and in The Untouchables, it's almost about, I mean, I guess it is about an uprising being suppressed in terms of prohibition, and yet the oppression of the uprising is definitely in the seat of the hero, and to the point where the state, if you will, Kevin Costner's character, is aware that, you know, if the law changes, he would be on the other side. And this is something I want to get into, because the idea of the quote unquote untouchables, the fact that they are untainted, and the one thing, this is where it gets really touchy, because the one thing that they are untainted by is the alcohol. They can throw all the other laws out the window, which he does, and they acknowledge the fact that, you know,
it is incredibly hypocritical, isn't it?
He says, I've thrown out every law in the book to catch this guy. But the one thing, and this is the rule in the movie. Did you pick up on the rule in The Untouchables, Alex, about which of the Untouchables get killed?
They're the ones who touch alcohol?
They are the only ones who drink alcohol. So the little bookkeeping guy, he drinks out of the barrel that's gotten shot in the cowboy sequence, and Connery takes a secret drink from his cabinet right before he gets assassinated. And those are the only two who get killed because they touch the alcohol, which is the one rule that Kevin Costner sets up at the beginning of the film when he walks into his precinct and says, if you were taking drink, you know, I understand, it's not a big deal, but this is the law and we're upholding the law. And then he goes on to break every rule except for drinking alcohol, and he gets off scot-free.
It's so... That kind of throws everything about in every theme set up in this movie out on its head, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's so heavy-handed on the whole thing, and yet it doesn't really follow through. And I get that we get to this point where
inconsistent.
Costner is kind of an anti-hero, but he's not really an anti-hero because he still comes off like he is the hero. So it never falls fully in the noir where we get like a Philip Marlowe who will break the law, but we're not really supposed to be rooting for him. We're just following him. And this kind of like, again, almost like a John Waynian hero kind of, but it's like, it wants him to be the White Knight. And yet
he's not.
Yeah. He walks out with his white armor stained with blood.
Yeah. No, he's very much decides somewhere along the line that he is the law. Whatever he says goes.
Yeah.
And that's it. Which I would say if this is a story that shows the danger of that kind of thinking, I think I'd be totally into it.
But it doesn't hit that line.
But it doesn't. It holds him up as the hero. It's like, yeah, look what all the good this guy did. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
And you could almost call it nuance, but it doesn't feel that way because it feels like it's setting up good guys and bad guys, and Kevin Costner's on the good guy side, not on the line.
It's very blatantly two former cops justifying what they did.
Yeah. Yeah, not to say that like the end result wasn't desirable, but the methods definitely matter.
Yeah, they took very dirty methods to get there, and which it's interesting. You can actually come out with the right idea from this movie, that they were being super hypocritical. I feel like a lot of the people who are in love with this movie don't feel that way.
Yeah, and you can watch it like it's fun. Okay, it falls way more on the fun end of the spectrum than an Apocalypse Now, like deep delve into the dark side of humanity. But I think what we're getting at is that it feels like it should have been that more than it was.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, you can definitely just watch this and enjoy the era and the crazy camera work and the shootouts.
And the cast itself. I mean, the cast is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from Kevin Costner, we've got Sean Connery, we've got Andy Garcia, Robert De Niro, both holdovers
small
from
role for De Niro.
I know, but it feels so typecast.
It very much is, yeah.
But I will say, I mean, even Andy Garcia was in The Godfather, and it kind of feels like this film and Apocalypse Now, like they're pulling a lot, like there's a lot of overlap with the American New Wave. So I think if we haven't established, like, there's no clear division between the American New Wave and the Film Brats. They became more popular at the very end of what we consider the American New Wave. So I feel like this film definitely pulls a lot of those actors and influences from the American New Wave proper and almost transitions us into this new modern filmmaking. Kevin Costner or Sean Connery feels like almost a changing of the guard. Robert De Niro almost does too. Like he's almost homaging himself already. And that kind of thing. The film feels like it is almost a transition point. And I know that there's a lot more films that go into the Movie Brats. They're not even like technically done. Most of them are still making films. But it does feel like it's kind of right at the point at the end of the 80s, before the early 90s, when a different type of filmmaking was starting up.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a significant turning point in the history of Hollywood and movie making. But with that, Jonathan, do you want to move on to overall notes?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, Jonathan. So I think we're dealing with, when looking at the Film Brats, the thing that stands out the most is that this is the first generation of filmmakers that truly grew up as huge film fans and really studied the art of cinema and both the canon of cinema to a great extent.
Yeah, and internalized it to a point where they could both homage and just take those techniques as little building blocks of cinema and incorporate them into the stories that they wanted to tell.
Yeah. Yeah, it becomes, the movies become much more referential to themselves and their own canon.
Which can be a danger, but when used right and used sparingly, can definitely add to a film. I think of an Orson Welles quote from his interview with Peter Bogdanovich, where he says that films sometimes will go so far in the referential direction that they're like at the end of The Lady from Shanghai, when there's just like this endless row of mirrors that are just reflecting each other. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes along. And so, at the point where film is only looking at itself and it's not pulling any other type of influence, it just feels kind of like parody. But if you can use those elements and add to them and add to really insightful works like Heart of Darkness and stuff like that, and bring a much more, modern type of take on it, like with Apocalypse Now, then you have expanded on what cinema is. Or even if you can just do something that such a wide range of audience can enjoy, like Jaws. Like, I don't know if I've ever heard of anyone who just doesn't like Jaws. Not to say that
it's a hard movie to dislike.
I know, not to say that it's perfect, but it's not dislikable.
Yeah.
On
it solidly falls into the realm of entertainment.
Yeah.
And it is very good at doing that. So you have people who grew up being entertained by these films and are very good at doing just that.
Yeah, exactly. But they also set the stage for what we're looking at now, because at this point, film school is common. You know, like even people who didn't go to film school, you know, have access to enough, you know, film trivia or film study material online that, you know, everyone feels a little bit like a film scholar. If they have an inclination that way, it's really easy.
Mm-hmm.
But that translates also into a generation of filmmakers who grew up with these filmmakers who've grown up studying film. Now it's almost more hard to get into film knowing nothing about film than it is to, you know, have gone through the process of studying film, studying these films and the films that these films are referencing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Certainly. Yeah, this is kind of the moment where the idea of kind of like not just enjoying films, but being a fan of films, being a cinephile, really takes root in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because especially with these types of films, they come with their own lore, like to an extent that films before did, but like, you know, if you're following the tabloids of what's going on with Apocalypse Now, or you're buying the merchandising for Jaws and for Star Wars and Back to the Future, like there is a connection to these films, and the audience is able to take a little bit of ownership with them as well, and that's become the standard.
Yeah. And this is also when it becomes easier and easier to return to movies, as movies start to run longer and have re-releases and be played on TV
and home
not
video,
so long
not
after they're released. And home video is right around the corner in the 80s from here. Well, I guess Betamax technically starts in the 70s, although I don't know if rentals were that big then.
But these are the films like tapes of Jaws and Star Wars and Back to the Future, like those blockbusters and tapes of Apocalypse Now, you know. These are the films that start stocking the shelves once home video becomes a thing, because these are the films that were out right before that, and they're like, man, that was really good. I'd like to see that again. And now you can go to Blockbuster, you know, coming straight out of this era, and rent them and watch them over and over and over again, wear the tape out.
Yeah. Make sure you rewind before you send it back.
Be kind, rewind. But it also sets the stage for films as fandoms, which I think is the predominant feature of cinema today, is that film inherently comes with a fandom. It's what makes films profitable now. It's what makes them desirable. Like, to have a film that you latch onto and make your own to a hyperbolistic degree is kind of just the norm. Like, again, going back to Marvel, like that is what Marvel hangs on. And that's what Star Wars still hangs on. Is why Star Wars is still a thing. And even these films of Spielberg, which I guess Indiana Jones still kind of hangs around, but not nearly to the degree of Star Wars. But yeah, Spielberg still makes films, and you still go see the Spielberg film because it's a Spielberg film, because Spielberg has his own fandom, which is pretty much everybody. But, you know, it's this thing
it's weird how the fourth Indiana Jones hurt the Indiana Jones franchise in a way that none of the follow-ups to Star Wars seem to have been able to kill that franchise.
And yet... the fourth Indiana Jones film did not hurt Spielberg the way that the follow-ups to Star Wars have hurt Lucas. So there's a weird thing there.
Yeah. Even though, you know, aside from the prequels, Lucas was not involved at all.
That's true. Yeah.
I think
the prequels
that might have more to do with this. True. That might have more to do with just the something about the size of a fandom and the percentages of a fandom and its proportionality to the toxicity of a fandom. Mm-hmm. So it's good and it's bad. Like we said, this has made some really good movies, but also there's been some very negative effects on both the way
culture.
movies are consumed and movie culture. It's become very divisive. People like stop being friends with other people over stuff like discussions over Star Wars, or decide they hate other people over discussions over Star Wars.
Or, I mean, even you think of Marvel versus DC is a whole other ballpark.
Mm-hmm. Or even the fact that because of certain decisions made while the making of a movie, people involved with that in the making of the movie are then subject to harassment by fans who don't enjoy the way it's the decisions that were made.
Yeah.
Which is scary because ostensibly it should just be a movie, like it or don't, but it becomes something more than that. The other things that we've seen because of blockbusters, merchandising, which is good and bad. Sometimes it's good because it can lead to something cool. And sometimes it's bad because it leads to something like Ewoks or Jar Jar Binks. Which, again, I'm not going to pass judgment on those, but it's not the most encouraging thing to see decisions being made in the making of a movie just over how profitable that could be on the back end, which has become incredibly common.
But that struggle between art and commerce has always been there. It's just,
it's true.
It hasn't always been in the realm of toy making.
Yeah. There's always been a balance between style and substance, or art and commerce. But I feel like one of the effects blockbusters have had is that they push both of those arguments, both of those balances off kilter.
Yeah.
So those things are both there. They're both important: substance, style, profit, and art. They're all important to the making of movies. But they have to exist within balance of each other. And I feel like blockbusters have unbalanced them in favor of style and profit, which is where you get one of Jonathan's banes of his existence, the Marvel movies, which are made almost exclusively for the sake of like merchandising and get by on style and CGI substance.
Yeah.
Or CGI style, CGI craft. Which
and to
isn't
some extent
inherently
star
bad.
marketability.
Yeah, which isn't inherently bad, but you can definitely make the argument that those pieces lack significant substance for that fact.
And yeah,
or
and the thing is
because they're so high concept, their themes become fairly reductive fairly easily.
Right, and kind of highlighting all that is just the proliferation of it. You know, like that. Those kind of popcorn, more surface fare is fine. And I mean, it's not to say that Marvel has no substance at all, but it's like when it feels like the only market is Marvel, it just gets like, okay, but there's more to film out there, you know? And that's kind of what we've been trying to do over the past 4 years is, 3.5, 4 years is look at what else goes into cinema and what goes into, you know, how we got to this point with the types of films that the majority of people are going out and seeing or hyping over after they come out and that kind of thing. But it's just making sure that the market is not limited to those types of blockbuster fare, and we still have the low concept films that make you that make you work for it. Honestly, make you work for the themes and leave you feeling a little disheartened, like Apocalypse Now does, just because it's about a general humanity and not just about the enjoyability of watching the film for the 2 hours that you're sitting in that chair.
Yeah. And it's not that those things shouldn't exist or that those things are inherently bad filmmaking, because they're not. They can be quite good. They can make excellent movies. It's more that the balance has slid so that, like we said before, low concept movies have almost been completely drummed out. Or relegated to art house fare or festival fare.
Yeah. Which is why I really like the not I won't say it's like a solution, but an approach to seeing film and paying for film that Ryan Connolly from the Film Riot YouTube channel brought up one time that I kind of resonated with is pay for the low concept stuff, pay for the stuff that's different, because where the money is, there Hollywood follows. So the more money that goes to those things that are more challenging and less easy to digest and forget or just watch over and over and over again because it's so unchallenging. The more we can kind of move the money away from that, hopefully the more Hollywood will actually pay attention. Because they're not going to pay attention to what we say. They're going to pay attention to what we pay for.
Yeah. Which, again, is to go back to the balance analogy. The other problem we're seeing faced is that the low concept cinema has swung balance in the totally other way, focusing entirely on art and entirely on on being meaningful art, totally losing focus on being profitable.
So heady that it's
and
almost
sometimes
unenjoyable.
Almost entirely, basically almost losing the idea of film both being art and entertainment.
Yeah.
Being like, you should enjoy this because it's meaningful, which it might be meaningful. It might be really well constructed. But part of the appeal of movies is that they create a message through story that is exciting or fun or appealing to ingest.
Yeah.
And if you lose that, it's not that there isn't a place for that. It's just that it's not the one place that things should go to. And it's not going to make your message in your movie very successful.
Yeah. I mean, it's a balance that art has always struggled with, and it's why certain of the classics still hold up. Shakespeare has that mix of comic relief and action and also like really intense, like heady soliloquies and dialogue and stuff like that. But it's the blending of those things that make them stand up to time.
I mean, Shakespeare's a perfect metaphor or a perfect example because people love to point out that the stuff he made for the
it was for commercial. He needed
masses.
money.
Yeah, he was making commercial product, but the thing he did was put art into a commercial product and still make it appealing to those who thought they only wanted lowbrow stuff. He created, in that essence, I think, a true art form.
Yeah. You could almost say the same thing about Dickens, who was so popular in America to the point of celebrity, but he has wit and humor as well as deep human insight in his art in equal measure. Yeah,
exactly. But anyway, all that to say is that they're a very, very important group of people when it came to the development of motion pictures in the second half of the 20th century, and essentially creating the stage upon which the first half of the 21st century is going to play out. Although everything is currently dramatically changing. We're probably going to talk about this year's effect on cinema for quite some time.
But we got to get through this year first.
Yeah, we've got other stuff to take care of, though. And for instance, what are we going to talk about next week, Jonathan?
Yeah, so next time, not much lighter than this week, but we're talking about serial killers and some of the big movies throughout cinema, starting in 1955 with Night of the Hunter. And then we're going to talk about Silence of the Lambs from 1991, which most people are pretty well familiar with. And then Zodiac from 2007 by David Fincher, who kind of has a knack for serial killer films. He's got a lot of them that we were kind of looking at, but we're going to go with Zodiac just to bring it into the 2000s. And also, if you would like to support the podcast, we do have a Patreon. So over there, you can join our digital community on Discord and chat about movies and stuff with us and listen to our live on-air recordings. And also, if you'd like to donate to the $5 tier, we have a bonus podcast. Last time when we had Jason on, we talked about The End, a weird short film by Chris Landreth that is both deep and tongue-in-cheek and meta. So that was a very interesting conversation. But yeah, we would appreciate that if you enjoy what we're doing here.
All right. That's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Can I just make Jason do the Jaws theme? Because he'll do it.
You definitely should.